All right, so last time we looked specifically at the economic and social impacts of the wars. Today I want to get into a little bit more detail about the positive and negative aspects of the impact of these wars, and then just kind of briefly go through the ideas, political aspects, and kind of what that led to. And I think that the economic and political things in South America are very important because it really sets the stage for what and how the relationship between the United States and a lot of the South American countries, and even in the Caribbean and Central America, will play out the next 100 to 200 years. So, positive things. Remember, I talked about the other day about how the land was really kind of unready for mass production. So that was a positive thing. Not a lot of areas were totally devastated. There was a lot of rich raw materials that were there. It's not like the entire lands were destroyed. A lot of economic opportunity to trade with new countries as the Spanish fleet and royalists are basically leaving. You have the opportunity of increasing your imports, your business with Britain, who at this point are one of the more powerful countries in the world. And you got a lot of stuff. I mean, the thing is South America is very nutrient rich. They had everything from the Peruvian guano, the bat or bird poop that was on the shores of Peru, the silver mining in Chile, and the very rich land for cattle raising in Argentina. Now, the negative side was that despite having all these things, there was a lot of neglect. There wasn't a very strong infrastructure to make this kind of agriculturally rich producing land. Military conscription had decreased the workforce. I mean, like was said before, you were talking about 100 years of war, and that definitely increased the overall population. They declined. The slavery, the workforce that had existed in the past was no longer really there because in a lot of cases the slaves left after the war so that they didn't necessarily come back and work. So you have now figured out that part of the labor system. A negative part, well, there's a lot of positives of having Britain and the U.S. and different countries come in and trade. It's going to make them very dependent on that money. And politically, that's going to become a major problem. So one of the biggest impacts of these wars is that when you had this single authority taking over these former royal seats, many of the leaders like Bolivar were guided more toward republicanism, no idea of a free democracy, but of republic and an ideology of basically not giving power, but keeping national authority faced in a kind of small geographical area. And so this causes some issues because there's a lot of hostility as most of the state do not necessarily have national identity. And that's why some of the areas of like Paraguay and Uruguay could break off from Argentina. The privileges of the army and the church were maintained, which created a lot of inequality between especially the Amerindian, former slave, and then the Creole and the road kind of economic group. And so the Amerindian communities were really displaced. And that's kind of what I talked about the other day of like how that has impacted the cultures and their politics and their people over time. There's been a lot of disunion in these nation states and a lack of national identity that has continuously kept a lot of division going on throughout. So the idea of what they kind of lean towards typically is this idea of liberal constitution. So initially, there's kind of these factions of what were the conservatives and the liberals. So in order to achieve power and prosperity, they constantly in conflict. Typically, the conservatives trying to move things back to a way that things were during the Spanish authority, with the liberals trying to move away towards the ideas of the Enlightenment, freedom, and rights. And so what they did is they stuck with this idea of liberal constitutionalism, but it didn't necessarily work because when they created these constitutions, they often went to an authority who were referred to as caudillos, who were as dictators, basically kind of preventing the true liberal progress of creating kind of an Enlightenment era period of constitution or a democracy. And so this leads to in the 19th century the rise of caudilloism. basically military leaders like Bolivar, or other military leaders who basically keep the country together with like an armed national army by basically maintaining wealth and power over a region. It basically went back to old regional divisions of wealth and power that Spanish had already ingrained. And typically the dictators adopted the best policy that they could to maintain that control. And then this is basically what happens throughout South American and Central American and even Caribbean history, especially when the United States involves itself in their foreign affairs or policy in 1820, 1823. They become the country that starts to now invest in a lot of the powerful leaders, and that's when we get a lot of the back and forth with, if you remember what we discussed last year with like Argentina and the Falklands War, that eventually will become not just the U.S. and Britain, but it'll be the U.S. dealing with forces that want to take over, become communist dictatorships. And that's what we try to present. And so these caudillos are these military, powerful, elite rulers are the ones we deal with. And then sometimes it's a very tremendous cost, especially when we look at kind of the late 1900s, start getting into some of the factionalizations and civil wars that emerge and continue to keep South America struggling economically and politically. All right, so this brings us lastly to the Monroe Doctrine. And so the Monroe Doctrine is kind of an interesting piece of what I was talking about the other day, was that James Monroe passes this policy in 1823, which ultimately argues for non-colonization and non-intervention in South America, essentially saying that Europe could no longer involve itself in this part of the world. And it was a very symbolic gesture. Ultimately, he warns Europe that they interfering in any of the new independent Latin American or potential U.S. territories would be dealt with, and that we would be the country to do so. And a lot of this grew out of fear because they think Spain and France were going to reemerge as colonies. And ultimately, while there was that general fear, more of fear was to the West and the Russians, who actually started to gain territory and look at territory in Alaska. Part of this was to say to the French and the Spanish and the British, like, no, you're not coming in here. But it also was looking in the other direction to the Japanese, as well as even the Russia, saying, no, this is our territory. So there was definitely British interest in South America and Central America. And there was kind of a discussion about some sort of joint agreement between the British and the Americans of how to deal with this economically. But John Quincy Adams was very much against the relationship because he feared there would be maybe a prevention of further American expansion, because at this point, America is not even close to having a bi-coastal port. In fact, the only part of the northern part of the West that's close to the Pacific Ocean is near Washington. So ultimately, many of the American beliefs and historical arguments about what was happening is that after the War of 1812, the fate of Spain is crumbling. And ultimately, what the United States is looking for is a way to get the country to sympathize with a lot of these nations down in South America, to develop basically an argument for how they can become imperial. Because obviously, why would they want to become imperial? This is a country that was built on the idea of freedom and liberty. And here we see all these independence movements happening down south, and we're kind of saying like, hey, we should follow them. There's like us. Well, this is kind of where the hypocrisy comes in, because while they're arguing this and they're saying we support them and we want to help them stay independent, on the other side, they're doing things to try to keep them dependent on the United States. And in the idea of defending American interest in foreign affairs, if you Google this in this article, which the link is at the bottom from Digital History, there's a lot of great stuff that kind of goes into the history of like why this starts happening. So South American caudillos, the American Revolution. There are a lot of difference between these movements. In the U.S., the caudillos saw that the way that they could benefit their legitimacy was by going to the U.S. So you have kind of this kind of on the other side of this is, yes, America's being kind of hypocritical arguing for independence, but they were being, wooed into all of this by these caudillos who needed somebody to legitimize their movement. And so in the end, Monroe expressed exploit that relationship, and it begins the process of basically American revolutionary involvement in their struggles. And that is kind of the whole story of the political legacy, particularly with a relation to the United States, which is pretty significant. All right, so that's pretty much everything that we're going to look at this point. We're going to start looking next at the Haitian Revolution, and we will talk about that a little bit more.